Hi friends! Welcome to Lulu Blue Studio. This video is part of a two-part series where I will explain how to use two of the techniques of watercolor, wet on wet and wet on dry painting. In this video, I'm going to briefly explain what these two techniques are, and then I will mainly focus on painting with the technique wet on wet. In the second video that I will link, I will explain how to paint through the technique wet on dry. I hope you will enjoy. With the wet on wet technique, we are going to use, as the term says, a wet layer of paint onto a layer of wet paint that is already on our paper. With the wet on dry technique, we're gonna add some details at the end on our roses with a wet layer of paint when our main roses is already dry. In order to do this, we're gonna use some paper. This is Archie's 100% cotton cold press paper. We're gonna use some colors. These are Winsor & Newton Watercolor Professional, and then some brushes. I'm gonna be using this Princeton brush Heritage size 12, and of course I have my 2 cups of water. Let's start by choosing which colors we want our roses to be. My idea would be to create 2 center roses at least here, and then maybe some leaves. I will teach you how to use these different techniques. And for the color of my roses, I'd like to mix, for example, this opera rose. I don't mind if my palette is a bit dirty with the other colors, but I will have this opera rose, and I like very much to add it with this yellow ochre. I like very much this pink that is very soft in color. Okay, the way we create roses is to start from the center of the rose, and with our round brush we start from the center and we create some circular shapes with a very light pressure and with the point of our brush. And then as soon as we go further from the center, we start to add more pressure and do point of our brush and then the belly and then releasing. And we do this on different sides of the center part of the rose. And then we can change our hue slightly. We can add a bit more of opera rose, and then with the point of my brush I press, I use the belly, and then I release. And as you can see, these two paints are already blending into each other, and this is part of the wet on wet technique that we're going to discuss further in this video. So I'm going to change slightly the value of my color, and I'm gonna continue to create these circular shapes of my roses. Pressure and then release. I change the value and I do pressure and release. And I keep doing this because I want my rose to be a bit bigger. Pressure and release. And as you can see, there is already this layer, this petal that is very light in value, and there is some bleeding of this wet paint into the lighter value, the lighter petal. And we can keep doing this as long as we want, because we want the rose to be the size a bit bigger. So I added a bit of more pink. I changed the value by removing pigment and adding water. And then, for example, before the paint dries, I'm gonna be using a bit more of Opera Rose, and with the point of my brush, I just touch with the Opera Rose where I want my petals to be slightly darker. And in this way we are using the technique wet on wet, because I'm adding wet paint into a wet layer of paint, and I'm creating these shades and giving more color to our rose, first rose. I'd like to add a bit more petals, so, and this value is a bit more towards the yellow ochre. That's totally fine. Change the value, it's a bit lighter. And I think like this is fine. So as you can see, there is already some bleeding here. Here we can, if we don't like the effect, we can try to smooth it out like this. But as you can see, there is already a bleeding, for example here, of the ochre, yellow ochre, into the Opera Rose, and this is achieved through the wet on wet technique. We're going to create another rose, maybe another big rose here, and maybe this one can be towards the orange color, maybe with a bit of red, still warm colors. And also here we start from the center, so it's going to be a big rose. We start with our tip of the brush, we created these small C shapes, and then we can change a bit the hue, which is the color, and do press with our point and release, and then press, belly, and release. Change the value, press and release, press and release. I can change slightly the value, and while still this paint is wet, I'm gonna add a bit of this ochre color onto the wet paint. So we use this wet on wet technique, and we keep adding C curves that are basically other petals. And it's beautiful how the bleeding is happening. This paper, Archie's paper, is expensive, but the quality is so good that you can well achieve these results. Then I'm gonna add a new petal here. I can add more red here. So I'm using wet paint onto wet paint, and I can do it slightly bigger. This rose here. If you have the feeling there is too much water, you can use our dry brush and just take out part of the water from the paper. Like to add a bit more red here, and then I have the feeling that the rose is more heavy on this side, so I will add some more petals here. Right? So in this moment we have two roses. This rose where we use the opera rose and the yellow ochre colors, and there is the bleeding which is happening in a nice way, especially here. And here we have a more red rose that is achieved by using Scarlet Lake and the same yellow ochre, and it's still a bit wet. If you want, you can add, for example, some more details, for example, red paint in the center if you want, because it's still wet, so you can still achieve this wet on wet technique. But I really like how this is, how the result that we have already achieved. I like that this rose is red in the center part, and then it shades towards this yellow ochre. So we can, for example, add some leaves, and we wait for these roses to dry, and then we can add some dry, on the dry rose we can add some other wet details with our maybe smaller brush, and we can learn how to use this wet on dry technique. So for now we can add, for example, some leaves. In order to do the leaves I can mix some green. I will use this sap green, and I will mix it with a bit of red that I have on the palette to make it a little less bright. And then this is a loose style of roses, so the way I like to create the leaves as well of these roses is by using this loose style. So the leaves are not going to be super well defined, but for example with the point of our brush we create the stem where the leaves goes, and then pressure and release. That's how I like to create sometimes these petals. And even for these leaves we can use the wet on wet technique in order to add some details, some more pigment, for example at the base of our leaf. And as you can see here, because the two roses were still wet, we have used the wet on wet technique in order to achieve this bleeding of the green onto these yellow ochre petals. We can change the value of our green by dipping our brush into water. We remove some color and then pressure and release. We have a lighter value of our green. Now I'm going to change a bit the hue, so the color of this green. I'm going to create another leaf here. Pressure and release. Pressure and release. There can be another small leaf here that maybe we don't see all completely. And for example, we can then create another set of leaves down here, so we can create our branch here. And then using the same technique, I can change slightly the hue of my green by adding a bit of yellow ochre, and I can create a big leaf here with pressure, and then releasing the pressure with the point of my brush. If I want, I can add another side here of the same leaf, and this is a beautiful green leaf. And we can remove some pigment in order to have a lighter value. Pressure and release. And I can do the same on the other side, for example. Pressure and then release. These leaves are still wet, so we can use, for example, the wet and wet technique. I can take some more green and, for example, add a few details. I let this green blend into the wet paint Actually, this leaf was already quite dry, so I can drag the paint and the water out and fix the problem of having too much green in the just standing there. So I can create other leaves. Pressure and release, pressure and release. For example, I can have such a small one here, and then I like to add some green. For example, we can also make that the leaf is going on top, for example, of our rose. I think looks nicer like this. And we have our two main roses, we have our few branches, and I think this is already a good starting point to add some details through the wet on dry technique, and we will be able to do this in the moment this paint is going to dry completely. Hi friends! I hope you enjoyed this first video of this two-part series. In the next video, I'm going to explain how to use the wet on dry technique. Thank you for watching.